Well, as a tribute to all of you who are so punctual and who've arrived, we'll start now. I'm Catherine Marshall, and I welcome you to the Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, which is now 8+ years old. It's a part of Georgetown that brings together a number of different departments that are concerned with the rather complex and increasingly the focus of attention issues around religion and public policy. I work on religion and global development, and I'm a veteran of the Berkley Center. I also head the World Faiths Development Dialogue, which is our partner in this venture, which is a small NGO that was born improbably, perhaps, in the World Bank, and which works on both research and on policy issues. So it's my great pleasure today to introduce a friend of very long standing, as we say now, we don't talk about old friends, and a colleague, Steve Heyneman. Steve I think his first professional experience really was in the Peace Corps in Malawi, and he developed, I think, a passion for development, for Africa, and I think for education during that period. I knew him. He was reminding me that it was in 1976 that he joined the World Bank, and he spent many years working in many different parts of the world, including he was one of the leaders who started rethinking after the fall of the Berlin Wall the role of education in the former republics of the Soviet Union. But he's also worked in Africa and Asia and Latin America, pretty much everywhere else. And in fact, one of the responses to the meeting described him as a giant of the field, which I think is very true. Steve is here because he has written and focused on a topic that's of great interest to us, which is how education is related to social cohesion, and particularly to addressing conflicts, whether they're conflicts among ethnic groups, but also religious groups, economic classes, basically how education's broader roles in today's pluralist societies are playing out, of what the potential is and what the pitfalls are. So one of our purposes today is to launch what we hope will be a continuing conversation. But meanwhile, what I want to do is to welcome Steve. He will speak. I don't know how long you'll speak.
All day, all night. No, you can put a limit on it. I'll speak to that.
Well, no more than half an hour, let's say, and then we'll open it up to what I hope will be a provocative and thought-provoking discussion. So welcome, Steve.
Thank you. I didn't know exactly how to frame today's conversation, so what we have here we can use, but we don't have to stick to it. And I have three parts. One part is an overall description of how social cohesion is influenced by four different categories of organizations. And then we go a little bit deeper into both schools and universities. I have a few results from international survey I did of world-class universities and their ethical components. And then I have a few words to say about the future and what we ought to be thinking about in terms of the troubled times that we'll be facing over the next decade with respect to battles within religions and ethnic identity, et cetera, which I think is going to be the name of the game. So if you have specific questions about how religion might be taught in schools, I didn't include that, but we could discuss that. Or what might be useful to think about as how to train religious leaders. We can also think about that. The story begins in Moscow when I delivered an analysis of the education sector in Russia. And typically, you analyze the productivity of the how much they spend and what they get out of it and what kinds of skills they turn out and the degree to which those skills might lead to increases in marginal productivity in the labor force. This is a model which has worked globally. And when I presented this to the minister in the early 1990s, he had no interest in it at all. Thought it wasn't even useful to him. And I was pretty insecure about that, thinking that I'd put a lot of effort into it. And so I visited my friend at the Russian Academy of Pedagogical Sciences, whose name was Vladimir Davidov, who was an academician. And he invited me into his office. He and I knew each other reasonably well by that time. And he was on the phone. And like a lot of Russian offices, there was a long table like this, and his desk is at one end, and there was a sitting area down at the other end, and he was on the phone, and he said, "Sit down." And he was shouting, yelling, and he slams the phone down. And whoa. He comes over, and I said, "Professor Davidov, can I ask you what's the problem?" And this is what he said. "We don't know what they're teaching out there." That was his. And all of a sudden it occurred to me that he was faced with the possibility that his country was going to come apart at the seams. 89 regions, and in 40 of the 89 there were majority-minority languages. And the Ministry of Finance had just downloaded all of the major responsibilities for financing and designing and delivering education to those regions. And they were using their newfound powers of education to right old wrongs, to make amends, to harbor old grievances that go back generations. And what Professor Davidov was explaining was that the place was going to fall apart. And then I realized that much of what we had done in the economics of education was concentrate on the wrong thing, that we had underplayed, underanalyzed the issue of why we have public schools at all. The first public schools were invented in Prussia in the 18th century when Frederick the Great incorporated a new county that was made up of Catholics. He was Lutheran. And instead of ordering everyone to become his religion, he asked the question which we ask ourselves today frequently, which is, can they be loyal Prussians but of their own religion? And so he invented a curriculum, and he invented two education laws, in which he financed that curriculum, which essentially was civics education. Here's what it means to be Prussian. But the education itself was delivered through Catholic schools, just as they had been before. Now, that is the origin of the fact that we have two definitions of public education. One which pertains to outside the United States and one which pertains to the United States. Public education consists of three different categories. It consists of public finance and public content and public delivery. But in every OECD country, except for ours, the United States, delivery can be done through a religious institution. France, Britain, Japan, they all can deliver as long as the content is agreed upon. So it struck me after that meeting in Moscow that I needed to learn a little bit about how education can contribute to social cohesion. And And so what you're going to see is the result of, I took a leave of absence from the bank and studied a little bit at the UNICEF Center in Florence, nice place to be, by the way. And so here is the model that I came up with, and then a little explanation about how it works. So social cohesion consists of an influence of two things: human capital, which you know about, and social capital. There are, for those of you who, the two kinds of social capital. One is bonding and the other is bridging. Bonding social capital is the feeling of being at home within your own group, within your religious community, or within your neighborhood community. Bridging social capital is the feeling of being at home with relationships with people who are not in your group. So both of them are necessary. One is far easier when you can have bonding social capital that can cause problems because they may not understand how other communities work. So the combination of them both influences the quality of social capital, and that can influence social cohesion. And here is the relationship to economic. We all want, for decades, and Catherine can attest, that we're all interested in what predicts economic growth and prosperity. Well, it stems from trade. Trade meaning not necessarily international trade, but the trade between individuals, where on the simplest level, if I need my lawn mowed and I promise a kid next door that I'll pay him $5 or $10 to mow my lawn, he has to trust me that I'm going to pay him, okay? Or if I give him the money ahead of time, that kid has to mow the lawn. He can't just run away. That's because you have a understanding of trade. And the more trade there is, the more honesty there is, and the more adherence to social norms, the better it is. And that comes from, issues of social cooperation. So matters of trust matter a lot. Now, this is created by organizations that are effective. Effective meaning that attain their objectives in a reasoned way. And there are four categories of organizations that influence social cooperation and trade and prosperity. One are social, and I include all voluntary organizations, which include the Bowling Society and every religion. I include economic organizations, which are businesses for reasons of making a profit. Include political organizations, which are all government, public sector management, and the honesty of the police and the customs. And we include education. So we're going to spend a little time talking about this, but we could talk about the social cohesion role of businesses or government or specifically churches, because they all have a certain role to play. And how you can tell of where you have higher levels of social cohesion, are where you have social contracts, without tyranny. I worked in the former Soviet Union quite a lot, and there was an absence of prejudice against different ethnic groups, but the reason why there was an absence of prejudice was because the sanctions were so high, and they were so draconian. When those sanctions were withdrawn, in some cases, you've seen it in Kyrgyzstan, you've seen it you had Yugoslavia, which busted into 10 countries overnight. So it's possible that they could break down. And the reason why they did not break down before that was not because you had social contracts that came out of norms, but social contracts that came out of a fear of tyranny, okay? Effective organizations, both of these are true. You have institutional rules which cross organizations and stabilizing traditions which operate within organizations. So take soccer, for example, Georgetown basketball. I mean, you can't, if you come to play Vanderbilt, where I teach, you can't change the rules, okay? You know, the time, the size of the ball has got to be the same. We all agree you can do whatever you want to beat us, and you won't, by the way. But those rules, and it's true with businesses, it's true with borrowing from banks, it's true with making trade and other agreements. There has to be some commonality on the rules of the game across organizations. That doesn't mean that my team can't have its own traditions within it, and your team can have. You ever see, I don't know, Germany and Brazil play each other? Very different traditions. Brazil was very, you know, in soccer, very, very unique set of play, and Brazil, very methodical, and they're both good, but they have very different, and both legitimate traditions. But they don't change the rules. So this is basically, you know, how it works. This is just another picture of that. Let's look at education. There are 4 ways in which schools, we'll talk about schools and then a few words about universities separately. Schools influence social cohesion in 4 ways. The first and the most obvious is through the manifest curriculum, which you can read. That's obviously distributed by central education authorities. And from that, you can gather the kinds of norms and values that they promulgate. And every country does this. There's no country in the world that doesn't have norms and values expressed in their curriculum. It's normal. But school climate is what actually the students experience. They can experience, even the curriculum may say that the country or the community is against racism. But there can be teachers who practice racism. So the experience of the child has to be taken into account, has to be measured. And the degree, the question is, how much is the climate consistent with the values that are expressed in the curriculum? Now, climate, I do not mean to limit the climate to the classroom. Every public school, or every school, is responsible for a child between the time that they leave their home and the time that they return to the playing field, the school bus, the cafeteria, the toilet, are all part of the school. And the experience, and you know many instances right here in Washington, where the experience of a child is antithetical to the objectives, the manifest objectives of the curriculum. So the child can pick up ideas that are inconsistent with this by being part of the school. And it's the school's responsibility, it's the school system's responsibility to make these as close as possible. And you can judge a school system that does a good job from a school system that does not do a good job on the basis of how distant those 2 experiences are. 2 other things. There's no country that I've ever worked in where where the public relationship with the education system isn't important. It's important in every country. And the real question is, how much do I trust the school system to be fair to my child? Okay. And the school system may brag about its policies, but if the public itself, if there are strong minority groups that feel that the school system is not fair to their child, you have a problem. Not just a public relations problem, you have a social cohesion problem, because they may feel as though the school system is more fair to other people's children rather than their children. So a school system's, one of the professional responsibilities of a school system is to help everyone understand why they make judgments, why they select some, the criteria, how they distribute resources, the degree to which those resources are distributed in an equitable, not an equal, but an equitable fashion. And so they have a public relations job. And then the mechanisms I've never seen a country where there weren't disagreements on what to teach the young. Even countries, look at what's happening today in Scotland. You look at Northern Ireland, you have 2 systems of education in Northern Ireland. You have a state system and a Catholic system, and the state system is essentially Protestant, and they teach different versions of history. all public education, all paid by the taxpayer. So essentially, when you don't have a mechanism of adjudicating, like a school board, when you don't have a mechanism of adjudicating differences between what the public would like to, between different versions of what the public believes is appropriate, then you stand the chance of having large parts of the curriculum which are taught but are resented. And we can go around, I can see many people from different parts of the world, and we could probably go to many countries around the world and cite examples in which that occurs. So how do you judge a system? You look at the curriculum, you look at the distance between what is actually experienced by children from the curriculum. You look at the degree of perception in which parents in the wider community believe that the school system is fair to their children, and you look at the quality of the mechanisms of adjudication. How does it work in fact? So here's what we've just explained, and this is what happens. Schools, particularly public schools, but not only public schools, are supposed to introduce children to the concept of what strangers do. Strangers, a psychological term, meaning people whom you do not know, people who are strange to your background. So if you're Catholic, it means, what do those Protestants do? If you live in the state of Ohio, it means those people from California are not all crazy. So it's a way of introducing them so that the level of strangeness is reduced. That's what public schools should do in every nation. They should also explain the reason for social conduct. Why do you pay taxes? Why are you subject to the draft? Here's how the laws work. And they explain the rights and responsibilities. Here is your right as a citizen, but here is your responsibility. And it's uniform across all citizens. And the obligations on those in power are terribly important. So your president, yay, we love our president, but there's a constitution and they can't run for more than X numbers of years, so that everybody understands the rules of the game. So this is what good schools can do. And that leads to contracts, better contracts. It leads to better understanding of the rules of the game, and that increases the chance of social cohesion. So a few words, I'm going quickly. Universities. Universities are different. Throughout the world, every country now, even low-income countries, have mandatory education. Universities are different because every person who enters a university is legally an adult, and they are there voluntarily. The law does not say you have to go to university, so the role of the organization of universities has to be quite distinct from the role of primary and secondary schools. So curriculum content is, of course, deeply important, and there one can go into universities and ask the degree to which they teach history, how they teach history, and the degree to which they teach students to be angry at their neighbors or understanding of their neighbors, the degree to which they teach both sides of a point of view, the degree to which they teach the history of religions, the history of what other religions adhere to, so that you could get a feeling for the degree to which their curriculum content may lead to or exacerbate tensions, or the degree to which it can ameliorate tensions. Campus climate, same set of issues as in primary and secondary education. Students can experience things on the campus. Look at the numbers of women who are today on American campuses who are saying that they have been sexually assaulted. Whatever we're teaching in philosophy and theology and chemistry is inconsistent with that experience. And so universities like my own and perhaps Georgetown are struggling to make sure that does not happen. Make sure that we reduce the risk of that. Because we cannot as a organization, our job is not just to deliver the content of curriculum knowledge. Our job is to fashion and form character. And you cannot be a great university until the climate and what you intend them to learn is somewhat consistent with each other. So we pay a lot of attention. Autonomous goals, well, good universities have their own goals. They state their own, here's what we believe. Here's our role. They tend to have strategic plans, whereas individual primary schools and secondary schools, you can't, you won't find that as much. But good universities all have, and we hold ourselves accountable for our own institutions. We have codes of conduct. We have rules. I sign a promise every year. Every faculty member at my institution signs a promise adhering to the code of conduct. And that code of conduct has interpersonal issues and financial issues and strategic issues. We don't use property to our own advantage. We adhere to a limitation on the number of days that we can accept contracts or consultant fees, et cetera. And of course, you know, the largest atomic bomb in higher education is plagiarism and the use of data illegitimately. And we rule ourselves. And when we find one of our colleagues who has abrogated that, we feel threatened. The entire organization is threatened, and we punish that colleague across a wide variety of ways, including actually the students, and I'm sure that's true here. The students have a honors council as well, and they sit in judgment of their fellow students if the rules and norms of the community have been abrogated. And the more you do that, the better, the more likely it is that a university can lead to greater understanding. So what else do they do? Well, universities can sponsor purposeful discussion of sensitive issues. So in some cases, universities will actually sponsor discussion on issues. Look at immigration in Europe, for example. Some of the universities are sponsoring discussions of the tensions that have accumulated over, and what does it mean to be a Dutch citizen? So, and universities can do that on their own. You know, they don't need the authority of government. They can do it because they believe it's right. So they can discuss, for example, why is it that we often separate religion and the state? And what is the origin of that? And what are the pros of that? What are the cons of that? What are the difficulties if you have a state religion? Universities can sponsor discussion of this terribly sensitive and controversial set of issues. They can sponsor how others think about God and the practice of their faith. It's perfectly legitimate for universities, for a Catholic university such as Georgetown, to have classes on Islam, and why not? And it's perfectly legitimate for an Islamic university in Peshawar to teach about Catholicism, and why not? And the more they do that, and the more they do that as a part of their professionalism, the greater the chance that universities can play a role in increasing the possibilities of having social cohesion. So they have a pretty important possible role. Universities, since the beginning of time, have claimed, I know not always with success, but they have claimed that their job is to seek the truth. That's their job. They have no army. They have no political or administrative power, but they do have this responsibility of asking the question of what is the truth here. So knowing that that is their primary organizational principle alone makes them unique institutions. And as I mentioned before, they can actively promote their goals in an autonomous way. They are and can be independent from the state. And they can model institutional behavior on how to conduct research on delicate issues and discussion, modeling the debate. I mean, a debate here at Georgetown, for example, I've not been to one, but I can imagine that you don't allow name calling. You don't allow ad hominem remarks about your opponent. There are rules of how you discuss things, and it's that example of how you sponsor those discussions which leads other people outside the university to understand how civilized discussion can occur. So universities have quite a large role to play in that. Tolerance of differences. Universities are some of the first to say we welcome all people from different walks of life. In fact, as I'll mention, diversity is a criterion now of the quality of education. So it is something that all great universities are seeking today. And there's a competition across the globe in terms of diversity. So in order to demonstrate that they believe in achievement goals and not the inheritance at birth. Fairness to all. There's a code of conduct on how I grade, and that code of conduct, and I've done research in talking to professors in Kyrgyzstan and Kazakhstan and Georgia and many other places in the world, and the code of conduct that I adhere to is similar or overlapping with their own principles of fairness. You don't judge a student's paper because they're tall or short. You judge a student's paper on the quality of the ideas that they present. Judgment on the basis of achievement and effective management of unprofessional conduct. This is the key and a crisis, I might suggest, in universities around the world with the onset of corruption, of paying for grades, of paying for entry, of money under the table for various privileges of one sort or another. So universities universities that adhere to these principles can lead to social cohesion. Universities that do not adhere to these principles can threaten social cohesion. Universities are not good of themselves. Universities are only good if they behave well. And there are many instances in which universities do not behave well. Okay. And here is, what I have just mentioned, a resistance to corruption. So I'm going to show you just a little bit of results. We did a study of world-class universities around the world, and I'm going to briefly show you some of the results of that. First, what we did was find a list of ethical infrastructure elements. I'll show you what they are. Then we took a list of accredited universities in the countries we studied. We took a 10% random sample, and I had research assistants trained to work in these languages. Here's the list of ethical infrastructure elements that we could find: a mission statement, honor code for students, codes of conduct for faculty and administrators as well, non-bias in hiring, statements of criteria used in faculty. So what we did, we didn't assign weights to these, but we just added them up to see to what extent universities emphasize these in their public statements. And here's the result. So of the Times Higher Education Supplement, one of the several international rankings of university quality, this one comes from London, 98% of the universities that are highly ranked in the world, 98% had one or more of these ethical. So it is uncommon for them not to. Almost all did. And the average number of elements mentioned was 9.2. Here's Britain, Canada, Hong Kong, Japan, Korea, New Zealand, Singapore, Taiwan, The United States has lower, what we found that one of the problems, one of the reasons why it was lower was located in the for-profit higher education institutions in the United States that rarely mentioned these elements. Now, we have here Armenia, Gabon, Kyrgyzstan, and Kazakhstan, where it is not common at all to mention any of these ethical infrastructures on their advertisements. What does that mean? Well, here is an average number of infrastructures by country, which you've just seen. Here is the kind of infrastructure elements from the Times Higher Education, the major world-class universities. Diversity and equity, the most common, integrity, non-bias in hiring. The least common were admissions of how many infractions there had been and what has been done. So that's less likely for a university to. Now we inform the public of the infractions of plagiarism, the students or faculty that have been charged with various infractions, and we don't give their names, of course, and we give the list of the sanctions that had. So last year, you can go to our website and you can see, well, there were 3 students that were expelled or whatever. But that's not very common, so less common than statements of principles. Now, here's the results of that. 98% of the, I mention this for one reason. I mention this because these world-class universities come from over 40 countries. And so sometimes I get a question by saying, oh, Heyneman, you're talking about principles that are Western, or you're talking about principles that only apply, to developed countries. I don't believe that's the case. I believe that if you want to be a great university, here are the elements that you have to consider. And that doesn't matter. If you're in Japan, if you're in China, if you're in Hong Kong, if you're in Moscow, these are the things that if you want to be a great university, you have to have ethical infrastructures mentioned in your, you have to consider them. So I believe it's global. Here are the most comprehensive ethical infrastructures and the most common elements, which I've just mentioned. I couldn't find any correlation between the number of ethical infrastructures and growth rate or GDP per capita, so that hypothesis was not fruitful. But my conclusion would be that virtually all world-class universities have ethical infrastructures. To me, that suggests that they are required for universities with ambitions of world-class status. And that means all universities, because universities, even those that are not listed on the Times Higher Education Supplement, East Kazakhstan State University wants to be a great university. So my message to them is here how world-class universities organize themselves. And I think that is a universal trait. So it's not fair to conclude that universities with a low number of infrastructure elements are more corrupt, but it is fair to conclude that universities which care about their international academic reputation will have to have an ethical infrastructure and describe that ethical infrastructure to the public. So in summary, there are 4 categories of organizations which can affect social cohesion. Among them are schools and universities, and they have unique roles. And it is possible to redesign universities and schools so that they are more effective. It's possible to analyze them, it's possible to calibrate how they're doing, and with encouragement from public authorities and private authorities, it's possible to help them. Let's talk about the future. I believe, and perhaps you do too, looking at the newspapers every day, that what we see for ourselves in the next decade and for our children is more conflict, more anger, more retribution, more misunderstanding. And this comes at a time when there are more people educated in the world than ever before. So it's kind of an inconsistent tendency. And I think there's certain reasons for it, and there's certain things that we can do about it? I believe that there's a need for careful alternatives from the inside. That means what you're doing with respect to Islam, what you're doing with respect to Buddhism, what you're looking for internal both organizations and individuals who are asking the question, why is my religion being hijacked by extremists? What can I do about that? I as a Muslim. And so there's a way of approaching that, and I think you are involved in it, but from the inside. And why I say from the inside is that I don't think this is going to be useful to be a priority for USAID for reasons that people are today judging the content of ideas on their origin. They're coming to the conclusion that if it comes from the United States, or if it comes from, name your country, it's therefore suspect. I think we have to recognize that, and therefore seek alternatives from the inside, which exist. I think the institutions that would be involved are the religious organizations themselves, the churches and mosques that that you're studying in Myanmar or in Bangladesh or in India or in, they have moral and ethical overlaps that are in common. And the question is how you help them organize. Local NGOs, and I say local NGOs because look at what's happening throughout the former Soviet Union. NGOs, and many times in China too, international NGOs are being outlawed. They're being treated as traitors. They're being asked, where does your money come from? And if your money comes from outside, it's being thought of as being suspect. Our vision of a civil society in which you have, 100 flowers blooming at the same time, which is good, is not always their vision. And so I think we have to recognize that local organizations, not international organizations, might have an advantage in working locally. I believe, there's a lot of debate, Catherine, that international organizations have taken a lot of heat for various reasons, and some of it quite justified, including the World Bank. However, the international organizations do offer the opportunity to be seen as professionally neutral. I think I deal a lot with UNESCO, and UNESCO, it has the terms of reference to actually take a role here, but no one's really ever asked them to. No one's ever helped pay for it. And my belief is that parts of the United Nations here can set the standards for what's right. The private sector. I believe that businesses which operate in different parts of the world do have a role to play, and in fact have their own social cohesion role. Standards of conduct, that OECD rules against corruption are considered the norm, but those are not always adhered to, and I think individual businesses can do a lot more. There's a whole burgeoning area of corporate responsibility. It used to be that corporate responsibility was seen solely as philanthropy done by a profit maker. Now, it is how we operate, who we hire, how we promote, how we advertise ourselves as being fair to the world. Who are our suppliers? Do our suppliers adhere to codes of conduct? How do we know? And so that, to me, is, while it starts in, let's say, pick Sweden, it doesn't stay in Sweden. It can operate just as easily in Bangladesh. It can operate in China. And so there's a kind of role that the private sector can play that I think is and can be maximized. And then schools and universities, as I have tried to suggest. What are some of the actions that can occur? I believe in something called safe talks. Chris Siepel has helped me understand the meaning of that. It means you talk with people who are participants, but in a safe place and in a safe way. You know, you don't do it in public always. You sometimes do it in private, and you introduce yourself and you introduce them to each other in places where they can consider it safe. That's where you can see progress. Safe assistance, and here what I'm talking about is intelligent assistance to places that are safe and to people who want to engage in dialogue, but not advertise. No thumping your chest saying, we solved the problem in this country, and not going to work. So we have to conduct ourselves differently. And lastly, training and education. As you well know, the skills of talking to people who don't believe what you do and of giving them the understanding that you have heard them, listening skills, the way of acknowledging that there are differences in a safe way, and the understanding of certain important pieces of research or philosophy that can help them put a context onto their strategies. All of this can come through training. When I was at EDI, we had something called senior policy seminars. 3 days, very short. And what I would think might be useful to consider would be something similar for certain religious leaders, not in the newspapers, okay? And 100% confidentiality. You can say whatever you want in this context. No reporting. And get people used to a context in which these ideas can be discussed. And I think education. I think we could have a master's degree in education and social cohesion. I think it could be at this university or a university in Asia, or I think there could be a reputation built. And then, if I can use a kind of brusque term, but a brand built on what that content means. And you who have passed this are kind of honored to have this certificate. You who have a master's degree in this. Cohesion, social cohesion. So that's how I see it. Questions?
Great. Well, who'd like to start?
Hi, my name is Crystal Corman. I'm the program manager at the World Faiths Development Dialogue. Thank you so much for your talk and for setting the stage for hopefully an interesting discussion and conversation. My question, you touched on it a little bit, so I'll just ask a direct question and ask you to respond. What do you do in contexts where the state doesn't want universities to think critically and doesn't want universities to be inclusive and diverse and have a variety of opinions on campus? And in fact, the state has mechanisms to monitor scholars and academics and will boot them out when they say things that they don't like.
First of all, that's the norm. Right from the beginning, states and universities have had an antagonistic relationship. I've never known a country that wasn't worried about its universities. And countries that are authoritarian take more direct action than countries that are not. So this is the normal kind of thing. And I don't think you can convince a state to think otherwise when they feel threatened by the truth. What you can do, however, is ask them what they want for their universities. This is why I showed you the universality of these mechanisms of ethical infrastructures. I've never known a government, even very poor governments, to say, we want a world-class university. I say, okay, here are the ingredients of a world-class university. It's like saying, well, we want an automobile, but we don't want you to make the engine, okay? So you want an automobile, here's how an engine works. So I think over time, and slowly, and in countries individually, there will be progress on this. But I acknowledge 100% of what you're saying. I've worked, I mean, the Soviet Union systematically defanged their universities because they put them all under sector ministries. There were only 2 out of 512 universities in Russia. There were only 2 that had their own budgets, and only 2 that had autonomy. And all the rest were under sector ministries, health. And so you can't operate with autonomy if your sector ministry is telling you what to research and how quick they want it. You're essentially a contract shop for that. And that's how universities were seen throughout the former Soviet Union, all of them, and in China as well. Now, that a big adjustment, now has, occurred, so that they can see that universities, in order to be great, have to be autonomous. And it's difficult for them, but they're learning. So it's a matter of progress. So you name the country, and we can kind of talk about what the problems are in that particular country. Okay, but I acknowledge that it is a imperfect road. Which one?
Iran and Malaysia.
Iran? Both of them, yeah. Well, Iran wants to have great universities. They always have. And they have some very smart people in those universities. And often they have firsthand experience with some of the greatest universities in this country and in Europe. So they know what a university needs to attain. In Iran, I think it's just a matter of time. In Malaysia, the problem is different. Okay, it's a problem. I mean, they want to buy their greatness with their university. A lot of facilities, very modern facilities, but it's a Potemkin village in terms of freedom. Okay, China as well. Okay, other questions? Larry. It's one of my colleagues from the World Bank.
Hey, Larry Wolf, a former colleague of Steve's. Maybe we're still a colleague. I know it's much easier to look at issues related to universities that are seeking to be world class, but as you know, 95 or 98% of all higher education students are not in world-class institutions. They're in community colleges in the States. That's 50% or more in community college. They're in teacher college. They're in basically teaching colleges. Perhaps there's a different set, or maybe the same, but maybe you could talk about how you would look at building social cohesion in the non-university setting.
I use the competition to become world class because it's a pretty clear illustration. But the universities that you're talking about, Larry, also have ambitions to be fair, to teach without prejudice, and there are certain codes of conduct which many of them already adhere to, which could be improved. And so I think the AAUP, the American Association of University Professors, and its international equivalent, they have a code of conduct. There's the EI, the Education International, the International Association of Teacher Unions has a code of conduct, and countries sign on to them. So we've got a structure that I think we can work with. We have a kind of reference point that it's not Western. Being fair to your students is not a Western concept, it's a universal concept. Judging people on the basis of their accomplishments is a universal concept. So I think in the teaching colleges and in southern Bolivia or in Guatemala or wherever, we can approach them with the norm and ask them whether they would like to improve their self-governance along those norms.
I'd be interested in you bringing out a few examples of places where there are bitter ethnic or religious conflicts where there's been an explicit effort to work through the issues of curriculum or of school climate? I know that you've written about the Balkans, but and where have they worked, and where perhaps have they not? You also mentioned Northern Ireland.
There's a great article by a colleague of mine that we published in Prospects on the Islamic university systems in Indonesia, which teach tolerance through Islam and stand out as a set of institutions that in fact help, I think, modify the more extremist elements within Indonesia. All three Baltic countries had large populations who spoke Russian. And yet they all wanted to join the European Union. And they, in the early 90s, they all put in rules and regulations about what language can be used, and which was discriminatory against Russian speakers. And they had curriculum in the beginning which lauded traditional Latvian values at the expense of ignoring values of Latvian citizens who were not Latvian in their ethnic identity. Now that has been revised, in part because of the European Union's influence. Look at the textbook, The Old Enemies between France and Germany, who have fought how many wars over the last century. After World War II, they set up a joint textbook commission. And that commission has the right to comment. They have no adjudication, but they can comment on textbooks that come out in their neighbor. And a year ago, there was a small announcement in the New York Times, very important to me, but which said that with new textbooks in France and in Germany, the textbook commission had no comment. In other words, over time, these two traditional enemies had come to a point where they could explain the origins of World War II, maybe World War I as well, in a way that their previous enemy had no objection. I think that's progress. And I worry about the textbook battles in Japan and the antagonism with Korea and China, because we haven't seen the same degree of progress on that same issue. This is why I think an international organization such as UNESCO or such as an international NGO can help adjudicate these problems of how you teach history about your neighbors. I think there is room for improvement. Georgia now has, they haven't solved their problem of education corruption, but they have designed a curriculum now that is fair to their minorities, including some of the minorities who they're still at war with. And they have done this in a way that is consistent with, quote, European values. And they have done it rather well. Other countries are, very worried about Kyrgyzstan and how they're teaching Manas, which is their traditional Kyrgyz values, but leave out the Uzbeks and Tajiks and Russian speakers. I'm worried about Kazakhstan still. So there's a long way to go, Catherine. But there are instances of progress.
Really loudly. You could go first, and then Melody.
I'm Cameron, a former student of Steve's, and I'm now at Chemonics. So my question is kind of related to international development, I guess, and the context of these governmental NGOs, but also just one of practicality. Unfortunately. I'm 100% behind this, and in an ideological world, just saying that people should do this would be enough. But what do you think the actual catalyst for change in a lot of these places will be, or should be, or in reality, I guess in reality will be, especially in reference to K-12 systems, so not within the universities. You know, is it everybody wants to monetize things and see the economic benefit? Is that the approach to take? I don't believe that would be the approach to take, but is that the approach, since that's what kind of the mainstream language is? Is it political pressure from organizations like the EU, kind of these more solidarity type movements? Yeah, where do you think that is, and if there's a difference between where it is and should be, how do we bridge that?
See, thank you, Cameron. I think international organizations and regional as well as global have a role to play. I think CMEO in Southeast Asia, I think the European Union has been enormously helpful in this regard, as well as the Council of Europe that has the headquarters of Civitas, which is the international organization of civics education. So I think international organizations have a significant role to play. I don't think economics should be discounted, however, as a motivation. I think everyone understands that civil war is bad for business. And I mean, I think one of the motivations now that you see in Myanmar is the fact that they're just now coming out from under a long period of deep hibernation, and they can see the advantages of adhering to world standards in trade, and they have an extraordinary growth rate, and all that is being threatened with the antagonism between Buddhists and Muslims in their country. And they realize they have a problem. But there are Buddhists who have sensed that they need to keep the lid on, and they're anxious to know how. So I think that's one illustration, and I think we could go around the world and find others where governments have the sense that if this got out of hand, it would be fratricidal to their. Look, I think the illustration of Yugoslavia is pretty important. I mean, here you had, at one stage, you had different ethnic groups, different counties, and it was all held together under a rather authoritarian regime. And when that was lifted, the politicians used religion and ethnicity as a rallying cry. And it split the country into and so today, Yugoslavia, what used to be a multi-ethnic, is now a series of small ethnic countries which are struggling. And I think you could find that in many parts of the world unless we have an alternative.
Hi, I'm Melody Fox Ahmed. I work here at the Berkley Center, and just want to say go Doors. I'm a Vanderbilt alum. Thank you so much for your presentation. Exactly. So my question, with all the work that's going on around engaging difference and valuing diversity and global engagement, et cetera, that universities are engaged in today, both as, I think they see it as an academic obligation, ethical obligation also, because it makes good business sense, as you were saying. Do you see any movement to unite these efforts, or are universities tending to work in isolation? How can we really move towards an ideal of a global social cohesion through higher education? How are efforts being united, or are they?
Yeah, that's a very, very interesting question. I don't see any movement yet across universities to kind of band together on this, except in one area, and that is against the threat of massive corruption of applications to higher education from some parts of the world. Massive corruption. And each university trying to handle that itself is insufficient. So I'm watching them, they're now banding together and hiring consultant firms to help them. They're financing techniques to see who's telling a lie about their statements of purpose. How do we tell legitimate transcripts from illegitimate transcripts? So I'm seeing some cooperation for self-protection. I know that European universities are going to have a very similar set of issues because of the Bologna process and the possibility that many students from Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union will want to go to LSE with a credential that LSE may not know is legitimate or not. And so they will have to face that challenge. So from that, I can see asking the broader question of what is it about us as a university system which constitutes legitimacy, and I can see movement on that over time.
Hi, I have a question regarding online education. So not nonprofit or for-profit universities such as Davenport, but education accessible through MOOCs or other pathways. How do you think that might affect social cohesion? Because they can get access, but it's not the same way and it doesn't have the social climate. But are there opportunities for engagement of diversity in different ways where they can learn about it, where it isn't necessarily an institution in that country or in that region?
Let me try to respond to your question in two parts. First about MOOCs, and then about online access more generally. Okay. MOOCs are an extraordinarily productive. Does everybody know what a MOOC is? Or am I just using a term? Raise your hand if you don't know. Massive online courses are free to the public, offered by some very great universities, including MIT and Harvard and Stanford, to anyone in the world. And anyone can sign up, and the courses are often very innovative and with curricula that are state of the art. So if you're interested in nuclear engineering or biomedical engineering, you'll have a MOOC designed by the engineering faculty at MIT, and you can take it free of charge in Malawi and Malaysia and anywhere else. So the typical number of students that might sign up would be in the hundreds of thousands. Okay. There are some things about MOOCs, though, that you need to, it's a great advertising gimmick for MIT and Vanderbilt. It puts our name out there, globally. Of the 250,000 people that might sign up, 98% drop out. So a very small percent finish. And thirdly, they don't lead. Some of them are offering credit, but none of them are offering an access to a degree. So MIT is not giving away its degree. They're a very expensive university, and like all very expensive universities, they base themselves on face-to-face contact with the people who have invented the ideas. That's why the cost is so high and why the demand is inelastic. It goes up. Even if the cost goes up, the demand goes up. But the other element is online education more generally. And with international sources of bibliographic reference services, in Malawi, you can have access to everything that you have access to here at Georgetown. Now, that is a revolution. And because of that, you find that international standards of excellence in higher education are pervading in places throughout the world that they wouldn't. Kenya, Uganda, Mali, places that would not have had access before, now, under certain conditions, to be sure, have access to ideas and minds and references and literature that they could have never had before. So it leads me to believe that what we're talking about here, which is a intelligent kind of plan for combating the threat to social cohesion, can work on a more fruitful ground than we could have 10 or 15 years ago.
Hi, I'm Nat Adams. I work with Catherine at World Faiths Development Dialogue. So I had a question. You kind of set out this vision as of the university as kind of a beacon of ethics and morality in some way. But I guess you could see how some religious groups might view that as kind of encroachment on their territory in a way. And I wonder, my question is, how would you kind of prevent university development from exacerbating a religious secular divide?
Sure, that's a great question. Yeah, I think it's a step-by-step process. I think the fact that great universities sponsor intelligent history of religion and discussion across religion is a kind of symbol of what good universities can do and should do. It doesn't mean that you have many universities. I worked in the Middle East a lot. It doesn't mean that you have many universities in Egypt that can do that, or Libya, maybe Tunisia, but the context. But that doesn't mean that there's not a reference group of, a kind of beacon for what good research on Islam can mean. And for good research on Islam, you often have to go to the Sorbonne and not, to Al-Azhar. And that, it's just a matter of time before that's going to sink in. That kind of, they're in our religion, and look at the kind of way that they conduct themselves, and look at the notoriety that they have, and look how much they know. So I believe that is going. I believe that in Egypt you will have both at the University of Cairo and several other major universities, you're going to have the teaching of religion in more ecumenical ways, more professional ways, and you're going to have distinctions drawn between the teaching about religion and the teaching of religion. That distinction is going to be made more clear, and it's all going to come under the aegis, under the umbrella of having a modern country. Now, I know there's a threat to the idea that modernity requires, debate and heterogeneity of ideas. I know that. But I don't think they're going to win. I don't think that if you ask, I know it's so complex, just talk about Egypt, but there's a very large number, a very large percentage of young people who are on Twitter every day and who don't buy the fact that you restrict debate in order to be modern. I think time is on our side. I do think that caution and consideration and respect has to be part of our plan. Okay.
Professor Heyneman, my name is Cabell. I'm a student here, a master's student in the government department. I have a question for you about education and democracy promotion, and to what extent education could promote social cohesion through democratic ideals, especially vis-a-vis authoritarian regimes, which potentially complicates things.
Well, first of all, you know that democracy is not a universally accepted good. You know that. So sometimes we tend to think democracy is universally, no. China does not use the term democracy because it can be a threat to the way that they have conceived development. Okay? So I believe that through these four mechanisms that I've tried to briefly describe to you, schools can promote tolerance of neighbors. The whole problem with the Uyghurs, for example, in Xinjiang province, is possible that many people don't know that that they have legitimate languages and legitimate ambitions, and that they have a conflict of wanting to be part of China. Now, we're watching today's vote in Scotland, which is a terribly important vote. We watched how the Czech Republic, we watched how these things can be handled without bloodshed. And my sense is that over time, the Chinese will come to realize that talk is better if you have everyone around the table rather than just talking to your own, the people who agree with you, and that can lower the level of tension over time. I think, this, if you look at the Chinese curriculum, the manifest Chinese curriculum, about tolerance and sacrifice for the country and the good for the future and working hard and being diligent and being honest, it's all there. It's all there. They just leave out certain parts. But you work with the parts you have, and you look for overlaps, and you work with that. You don't point out, oh, you're missing a finger, or you only have one leg. Oh, no, you don't start with that. You start with what they do have. Okay?
Well, I think that, oh, there. Sorry, I couldn't see.
Hi, my name is Ghada. I'm coming from Saudi Arabia. Actually, I'm an international student, and thank you so much for your presentation. Actually, I have a question about the Middle East. You've said that you've worked in the Middle East, in Egypt, and you said that you cannot see it, this word, universities in Egypt, but you can see it in Tunisia. Actually, and also I'm referring to about what you've said about the Islamic universities in Indonesia, I think, or Malaysia. So we have in Saudi Arabia 2 Islamic universities, and I think it's the title is Islamic, but other universities in Saudi Arabia, it's not Islamic, but it's apply the Islamic rules, because they are an Islamic country or something like this. So referring to all these things, you said that you cannot see this in Egypt, you can see that in Tunisia. What do you think about, I'm sorry to ask this, about Saudi Arabia and Qatar and other countries? I know this is, something really, there is no compare between Gulf country and, other Middle East. But it's just curiosity, because I've been working as a TA in one of the Saudi university, and I have seen a lot of things that it's not,
Yeah,
I agree with that. And eventually, I'm sorry about my broken English,
No, it's
but
fine.
I have to ask this
Fine. It's just
question.
fine. May I ask, which country do you come from?
I came from Saudi Arabia.
Thank you. So if I understand your question, you're asking me about, you've noted that I have used references to Egypt and Tunisia and Indonesia, and you're asking perhaps about universities in Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states.
Yes.
Okay.
Because if you know that in Qatar we have Georgetown in Qatar, and we have in Emirates some of the other universities. Yeah.
It's easy to be pessimistic about universities from outside of Saudi Arabia that are now, including my own, that has a branch in Abu Dhabi. And there are tensions, to be sure, right from the beginning, about the freedom of academic freedom. But, help me here because it's your country, but I sense this strong motivation, particularly in Saudi, to be part, to divest themselves from their single primary product, wealth, and become a trading partner, a banking center, a tourist center, a center of trade and respect. And they are building several major universities in Saudi Arabia with state-of-the-art facilities and inviting students from different parts of the world to study there. Now, I'm not naive, and I'm not a Pollyanna. I don't think this is going to change Saudi Arabia overnight, but it is going to influence Saudi Arabia over time. The one thing I have noted, if you look at, if you look at the results from PISA, you know, the program of international studies, and you look at the results from the Middle East, they're pretty frightening in the sense that there's quite low achievement. And it's particularly problematic in the Gulf states. But we've broken it down by gender. And of all the regions in the world, the place with the largest gender gap in achievement are the Gulf states. In fact, in Abu Dhabi, if you just consider females, they'd be on a par with most European OECD countries in terms of females are outperforming males to such an extent. And the question is, why? And perhaps the reason is that females tend to be looking at education as a mobility enhancement. And because in so many other parts of life they are under constraints, they are going to be the scientists and the engineers and those that are in competition for essays and for research competitions. I mean, it's taking off. And I think that is going to be influential over time. So I don't try to look at Saudi Arabia today only. I try to look at it 20 years from now, 30 years from now. And I would sense that there would be much more tolerance of ideas that are not guided solely by religion, and tolerance of people who believe in those ideas because they want to be part of the modern world.
We're coming, I think, to the end of a fascinating discussion that certainly leaves us with a lot of unanswered questions about what we should do. And I wanted first to thank you, Steve, for thought-provoking and provocative statements. But I wanted to ask you one last question. What are the research questions in this area on your mind? What keeps you awake at night? What do you think we should be looking at?
I'm going to use a term here that Larry and Catherine know very well, sector work. Whenever there was something really important and really new, the bank used to study it, and it was titled sector work. It means it was attention to a topic or an issue that demanded better understanding. And I think if we could think of a sector work approach, and we'd have to be invited in by authorities, and on the nature of how businesses operate in country X in terms of social cohesion values, how the government actually we may have already quite a lot of information on, how schools and universities operate, and have those kinds of pieces of examples to go on. I don't think this is a topic that can easily be addressed by experiment and control, randomized trials. I don't think that's a very easy approach methodologically, but I would say here's a theory, here's what we understand. Let's see if you like, here's how we see country X, your universities in country X, or your curriculum and perception of fairness to your children in country X. And I think from that, we would have a place to go from.
Well, thank you.